Welcome to Multi-Story. Cities contain a multitude of stories. Some are obvious and some are not. And we think it's really important to listen to them and to share them. So that's what we're going to try to do. I'm Matt. I'm a longtime lover of cities and a liver-inner of cities. Is that a thing? And I'm here with my friend Tess, who is a professional urban planner and thinks about cities for a living. Also here is Coletta, who thinks about cities, I would say a healthy and normal amount, if that's possible. Is that fair, Coletta?
Yeah, sure. I don't know what a healthy amount is, but
Okay, well,
less than you all, I think.
the discussion today is predicated around a recent trip that you had, Tess, to Vienna. So before we get into the super nerdery of this, just tell us about your overall impressions. And Coletta, I think you've also recently been to Vienna. So if you want to share your impressions, if they're any different, or however you want to talk about that, but normal traveler impressions.
Yeah, it was my first time in the city, so I was very excited to see it. You know, it's a famous city with lots of history and culture, and I was excited to see all of that. And based on your recommendations before we went, I was excited to see a lot of the new pedestrianization of the city center. So I think my favorite activity visiting a new city is just to walk around, and that was delightful. You know, palaces, gardens, lots of history, Viennese cafes. No complaints. It was a great city.
I mean, I think the thing that stuck out to me too was just like how well they had done some stuff to make the infrastructure good for both cyclists and pedestrians, and just like, you know, what looked almost like a 6-lane road that didn't have any cars on it was near the opera house, was something that like really stood out to me because I can't have a hard time imagining that in our city. So it's like, this is amazing.
Yeah, and I think I was surprised by how much brand new work there was, right? Like a lot of the streets were being pedestrianized as we were there. You could tell a lot of the developments had been built in the past few years. I maybe had this impression of Vienna as a historic city. But what really surprised me was sort of how dynamic it was. Like, it is growing fast. It is changing a lot. And mostly in ways that make it more livable. So that was really neat to see. Yes, you can have a classic historic European capital, and it can be dynamic and changing and growing. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting as a resident of the United States to think about, like you think about Europe sort of in idyllic fashion, like they've got it all sorted out. But the fact that they are retrofitting their infrastructure to be more bike pedestrian focused, and like every time you go to a city, again, it's dramatically changed. You think of that's kind of the American experiment, that we're fixing the cities that were broken. And Europe is perfect all the time, but it's not, right? So like there's huge opportunities for improvement. My question then, Tess, is when does it go from just a normal person walking around a city, enjoying themselves, looking at pretty buildings, to noticing something that gets you down miles deep rabbit holes?
Yeah, something catches your eye that you can't quite puzzle through why it is that way or how it got that way. And sometimes it's not easy to find the answer, which I will say doesn't make me a great travel companion for my partner, who is maybe not interested in trash receptacles or signs in the right of way or who knows what else. But yeah, that's what we're here for. Fellow lovers of urban esoterica, I suppose.
Joy in the otherwise seemingly banal, right?
Hopefully not too banal.
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
Just off the top, do you guys recognize this by chance?
I don't think I do.
No, I don't think so.
I'd like to say I did because that would make me sound way cooler, but
it's like a field.
Is it an airport?
Yeah. So yeah, this is a historic aerial of the outskirts of Vienna, and this is what it looked like a few years ago. But this is what it looks like now, which I believe, and apologies for my German, but I believe it's Stadt or Lake City. And basically, they have redeveloped this airport into an entire city, apartments, schools, offices. You see 10 and 20 and 30-story buildings. There's an elevated metro stop here, all new infrastructure. It's laid out to be an entire sort of self-contained city, which was interesting to me to just, when I was there, I took the metro out here and I'm just to see not the classic historic center of the city, but what a sort of new Vienna look like. And this is one of those places. And, you know, partly it's interesting because entire cities and neighborhoods are just springing up all over the Vienna area almost overnight. And just the scale of it is impressive. And I since learned that Vienna is like one of the fastest growing European capitals. But the other reason, you know, as a urban planner, that it's interesting is that a lot of this new housing is basically public housing. So there's 220,000 socially rented apartments. There's 200,000 like subsidized cooperative dwelling units, and more than half the population of Vienna lives in some form of subsidized housing, which is just a very, very different model than we see in the United States, right? With a very different connotation or expectation of what public housing is. And so it was interesting to me to see these new communities composed largely of social housing, which has a whole host of its own challenges and problems. The fact is that more than half of the population lives in some sort of social housing. And despite all of this culture and history in the city, and despite all of this growth pressure, the rents are like a third of Paris or London or Dublin, that sort of thing. So that's
Because
why I
they
went
build
there.
new housing, right? They actually go out and build a brand new town out of nothing and create supply. Is that the main reason?
Well, yeah, they are building a lot, no question. And I think they had I'm not an expert, but I think they had a gap of some decades. And now more recently, they are starting to build new housing again, and you're seeing more like this. But also, you know, when it's in the public interest for residents to have affordable rent, and the government owns the housing, it can subsidize the rents, and it can just decide that that is a public good worth investing in, right? That doesn't happen with, you know, privately owned apartment complex. So and, you know, they're not soulless Corbusier towers here, right? They're building neighborhoods and communities with public spaces. And when I was in this one, they had a little like farmers market set up with all of the vendors, and it felt very European, even though it was brand new. And so I was looking at this thinking, this is probably important for this entire conversation about affordable housing. This is probably really important about the future of urban planning. There's probably some models here that we can learn from and lessons that we can look at in the United States. But I'm not going to talk about that at all today because
Oh, no, I'm really excited to learn more. Okay.
Yeah. So just ignore all of that. Instead, while I was looking at the map on my phone on the way to the metro stop there, I saw this. And I thought, why are these neighborhoods developing in these lines, these long, skinny blocks that you can see here? It's not just the street grid, it's like the development patterns, the densities, and you can sort of see here that there's each of these like long linear zones that are forming these neighborhoods. And I was like, well, that's interesting. but it wasn't just by my train stop. So when I looked elsewhere in Vienna, I started to see it again. There's these rows of, here's this multifamily apartments, this linear park. Just apologies if you ever wanted to go back to Vienna, but once you see it, you can't unsee it, I think. So here's another example where we just see this development in these long and skinny rows throughout the city. And this is probably the most dramatic example, right? So if you look at these blocks, they're about 100 feet wide and 3,000 feet long with no cross streets in between. Like that is a choice, let's say, for urban
This
development.
looks like a child was playing City Skyline or something and didn't know how to use it.
Yeah, it was quite unique to me, right? And so I forgot about the future of affordable housing and urban development, and I became fixated on these narrow blocks. And as I looked around, self-evident how this came about, because you can see places that aren't fully developed yet, and you see that there are these long and narrow agricultural lots and that are getting developed, bit by bit. And you can see like, here's a row of houses, here's a row of houses, but next to them, there's still rows of these long, narrow lots. And the further you go out, the more that it's fields and less that it's development, right? So that was pretty straightforward. I was like, okay, these long, skinny blocks are coming from these long, narrow fields. But I haven't really seen that before, right? So this is Kansas, which I realized
That looks familiar.
I didn't, yeah. And as I said Kansas, which gives away my familiarity even more so, I think. Thomas Jefferson in all of his rational ambition just put 1 mile square grids across the continent. And, we can see that, the section line roads 1 mile apart follow the grid, and the land's divided up into quarter sections and into smaller pieces. And this is sort of the logic of land organizing around Kansas City, where we're most familiar. And then you see this transition from agricultural to urban development. So even in the heart of suburbia here, full of cul-de-sacs and windy streets, you still see these patterns where there's 1 mile section line roads on the outside of this sort of large block. And you can see where those follow the old quarter section lines, right? Those patterns are still in there. And here's quarter of a quarter section, and you can sort of see these individual neighborhoods built on these parcels, right? This is the unit of urban development. It's the same in Vienna and the same in Kansas City. You have incremental agricultural land that becomes developed and urbanized, and that's not the only way to build a city. You can master plan and build a new one. There's many ways that cities get built, but this was a very familiar process to me. What wasn't familiar, this is outside Vienna, is how did it get like this specifically?
Is that the same development that you were showing us earlier, or this is something entirely different?
No, this is, it's just a few miles from Vienna. It's just a little village outside of Vienna, but I think it's very typical of what's in the surroundings, which is a pattern that was brand new to me. I hadn't seen anything like this before, and I wanted to know more.
There are no right angles as well. That's like even though it's rural, like you understand historic cities have meandering paths, but like that's just like there's no rhyme or reason to the direction. Maybe there is that you're about to reveal to us, but like to my eyes, like where's north? They don't care where north is. It doesn't matter.
It looks like abstract art to me.
Yeah, I kind of want that print on my wall.
it's kind of beautiful, right? But
Yeah.
I think when you look at it, you're thinking there must be a logic there, even if I don't understand it, right? Um,
And I don't.
and I don't, and neither did I. So there was a little bit of a mystery there, but even more so because I was looking around Vienna. So this is 40 miles north, and this is at the boundary with Czechia, and that the pattern of the fields completely different. Uh, Slovakia, 30 miles east of Vienna, the pattern of the fields completely different. Hungary, 35 miles south of Vienna, looks very different than what was happening in Austria. Germany to the northwest, very different again. But even in Austria, 50 miles west, more like this, and less like those very narrow blocks. So I was like, okay, it's not just,
This is where we're going to get into like the Habsburg Empire or something, aren't we?
well, apologies, but yes. Um, so it can't just be like things are different in Austria because nearby in Austria wasn't that way. So I started looking. I was like, is this like some sort of cultural or sort of social ethnic distinction? It's like, no, well, it's sort of the this map of ethnic groups and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right, didn't align to where I was seeing these patterns necessarily. I looked at old political boundaries, historical boundaries. That didn't really line up either. I thought, okay, well, maybe I'm just finding this in this specific province of Austria. But when I looked closer at the borders of that province, that wasn't really true either. It looked the same on either side. So it's like, well, what is happening? I thought maybe there's something about the ground here that makes it imperative to grow things in that way. And there is this sort of little blotch of like black soil that is really good for agriculture that you can find in this part of Eastern Austria. And so I was like, okay, maybe if I look other places where they have these soils, do they have these types of lots? And this is just a zoomed in view of that particular type of soil. That was generally where I was seeing these little narrow and long patterns.
I'm just curious where you go for your soil cartographs.
Yeah, so the answer to that is
I mean, I feel myself going deep into this rabbit hole. Like, this is quite the journey.
I would have no idea where to find such a thing.
I was down here.
It's a lot of research.
Yeah.
Behind the curtain.
So I went to the Soil Country Analysis for Austria, which is this paper that was anyway.
I love
That's
it.
amazing.
So here's Romania, 500 miles from Vienna, another area where they had these types of soils. And lo and behold, I found these long and skinny lots. It's like, okay, maybe this is part of the answer. But here's central Ukraine, right in the heart of these types of soils. It doesn't look anything like that. So maybe there's something here with the soils, but clearly it's not the entirety of the explanation. And at this point, I would like you to come with me back in time 50 years to the University of North Texas. This is the campus of the university outside of Dallas, where there's a professor of geography named Terry Jordan. He was seeing patterns like this. This is outside of Laredo, Texas. He was seeing villages that were sort of developed like this or like this. This is along the Rio Grande. There were these agricultural lot patterns that were long and skinny, just all along the Rio Grande here. And he was looking at these and wondering, where did these come from? And not in the sense of how did they get that way, because he understood that there was this process of land grants in South Texas. So in the 1760s, a new viceroy from Spain began a process of land grants called porciones, which were dividing up these parcels of land, and they looked like they did because water was scarce and access to the water was important. And so each of the parties that wanted to claim one of these grants got a long, skinny lot, and each lot had access to the river. You can see the town of Laredo in the middle there. So that part wasn't a mystery, but he was interested in why specifically they chose to divide the land in that way. In particular, because he found that there really wasn't a precedent for this sort of long lot in Spain or in New Spain. And so in his paper, Antecedents of the Long Lot in Texas, he...
Beach read, the summer's hottest beach read.
He said that these lots came from New France along the Mississippi Valley and through Quebec and along the St. Lawrence. And from there came from France. And from there came from central Germany, and all the way back to these sort of traditional urban development patterns in medieval Germany, essentially. And he sort of researched this lineage. And so part of me looking at these long lots in Texas was this little nugget about how they didn't have professionally trained land surveyors. And so they enlisted the local colonists who were already there to participate in the dividing of the land. And I imagine that there were influences among these people who had already been living in colonial America near to French Louisiana and in other parts of Texas and Louisiana, where this development pattern was proliferating. They took that and applied it here on the Rio Grande. And that was sort of answer to his story. This pattern from New France, from France on the new colonies, was part of this seigneurial system. And it's sort of this feudal system where land was granted and then subletted to these habitants who had to provide payment or a portion of what they grew to the owners. And it was really sort of a neo-feudal land system implemented in parts of New France. And as part of that, they divided up these large granted land holdings into narrow parts. They were often along the rivers, which were the primary transportation routes. And as a little bit of a tangent, it was interesting to me that this seigneurial system, some people blame for persisting economic and wealth gaps today between Quebec and other parts of Canada. And I found that the final sort of feudal payment from this system was paid in 1970. So this was a system that had a long history in North America and shaped a lot of things. I find that fascinating, but I'm not going to talk about any of that either.
Is the word seigneurial significant? Is it like a proprietary term to that era, or does it have a significance like that you understand?
Referring to the seigneur, or like the
seniority.
Yeah, the owner of the land, and then the habitants work for the seigneur. Okay, so here's a map from New France, where you can see these long lots parceled out. And I wondered at first glance if maybe you could recognize it. And,
we had to cancel a trip to Montreal.
There's a
Quebec
few
City.
clues in there, maybe.
It's the writing is like super small on my screen.
Okay.
Um,
This
What is
is
that?
Ile au Cochon, which is Pig Island. Here's some camps of the Ottawas here. Um,
Is
and
it
it's in New
in
France.
Ottawa?
and here's
I don't know
another.
much about New France.
Yeah. Well, this is Detroit, and so
Okay.
here you can see um, where downtown Detroit is, but you see this historical long lot development pattern, both along the Detroit River, but also on the tributaries. And here's their map where you can see the sort of long lot pattern and like the oldest part of the town there overlaid. Here's another one where you see it a little bit further developed with some of the roads. And the blocks are more in a grid-like pattern, but you see the remnants of this long lots. And this is Detroit today, where if you look, you can see what began as these long and narrow agricultural lots sort of shaping the urban development in Detroit, just like it was doing in Vienna.
Interesting.
This is across the river in Windsor, I think, across the river from Detroit. And you can see that these narrow lots are still shaping how these areas are developing today. They're like, this unit of urban development is following the same agricultural pattern and having the same sort of consequences.
As an aside, I do think that the rebranding of Belle Isle from Pig Island was a good one.
A good call, yeah. Or it's
Yeah.
like, would Kansas City have made it if it was still Possum Trot? Probably not.
Yeah, fair question.
And so here's another block in Detroit, 300 feet wide, 2,600 feet long, not so different than what we were seeing in Vienna. And there's even places like this where marshy areas, these long, narrow blocks and the spaces in between were used as drainage areas. So remember this one for later. Further up the St. Lawrence, this is outside Quebec City. You can see this long and narrow lot pattern along the river. But it's not just along the river, it was along streams and other roads in Quebec. Here you can see these linear developments, sort of a village along a road and the agricultural lots behind it. And other places where the French settled, you could find this as well. So this is a book about French Illinois, and they talk about these ribbon farms and the different advantages that the settlers found in this sort of arrangement. So when you had a really long lot, you were more likely to have a variety of soil conditions on that lot, which was helpful. You didn't have to like turn your ox team around as often, and that made it more efficient. And of course, there were advantages in always having access to the road or the river when it wasn't easy to get around. And this is Prairie du Rocher, which is the Illinois pronunciation of this French name outside French Geneva. You know, and I grew up in St. Louis, and they don't really remember this pattern, but you can see here a little bit of those narrow lots along the river still remain. We go down to New Orleans, it's very obvious, this pattern. This is the Mississippi River in Louisiana. And today you can see all of these towns and neighborhoods and industries are developing according to these old narrow lot lines. This is outside New Orleans. Here's Baton Rouge. That one was New Orleans. This is False River, Louisiana. And you can see these narrow lots that sort of go around this lake. But it used to be the course of the river. So the course of the river changed, 1720 around then. But the French began settling this area in the late 1600s. So I don't know this for sure, but I think that maybe they began creating those lots when it was the Mississippi River. And after a while, it wasn't anymore, but they still remain and now it's like a recreational area.
Fun trivia, there's a part of Iowa that's within Nebraska because of an oxbow lake like that got cut off.
Yeah,
So you
yeah.
cross through Iowa to go to the airport in Omaha without crossing
There
the
are
river.
some parts of Missouri and Kentucky that are on the wrong side of the Mississippi as well. Or, yeah, rivers don't really care what we do, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not just the Mississippi. There's on these other bayous and canals. This is Lafayette, Louisiana, and you can see even their industrial parks are developing with these linear strips based on these old patterns. And this pattern came to New France from France. So I wanted to look at that a little bit because I'm currently in France, and those long and narrow lots were not something I was familiar with. And when I think of farm fields in France, I think of something more like what is in the screen, right? It's not a Jeffersonian grid, but it's not these very long, narrow lots. So I was curious how they got to North America from France. And after some exploring, digital exploring, in the northeast of France, especially in Lorraine, there is this pattern of village development where these villages would develop along a stream or a road in sort of a linear way, and then the agricultural fields would branch off from those. And this, to me, read very similar to what eventually ended up in New France. So like, okay, I followed this from Texas to Louisiana, Illinois, Quebec, back to France. But that article or that research paper from Terry Jordan was pointing to medieval Germanic origins of this pattern. So, and again, apologies for my German, but this Reichendorf or row village is a particular type of linear settlement that was common in Central Europe, and there's a bunch of different varieties of it. So this Waldhufendorf was this linear development where they would develop and they would sort of cut into the forest. And so when the Black Forest was first being settled, they would sort of build a road through it, and the farmsteads would face it, and they would like clear fields back into the forest and create this pattern, or sometimes the hillside. And here in Eastern Germany, you can see the old hedgerows and sort of stone walls of these, ancient fields and lots are still forming this narrow lot development pattern, where they're sort of carving into the forest and the hillside where they're mining.
So it's access to different kinds of shared resources, including roads. So it's not just necessarily rivers. It's one road could go through the countryside, and all these long farms can touch that road by being linear.
Yeah. There's lots of different unique variations, right? And the unifying feature seems to be that there is precious access to a limited necessity, right? That is what's concentrating things in this way. And so a Strassendorf is built along a street. So it's a village where the street comes first, and access to the street is most important, and then the fields are developed from there. So this is in Poland. This might be the longest linear village in the world, or so many claim. But you can see here that the fields are basically the width of a single house, but the field can extend for more than a kilometer back from the village. So first there was the road, then people developed along the road, and then they farmed behind the farmstead. There are other variations of this based on marshes or wetlands. So now I'm in the Netherlands, right, where it's not a road, but it's a canal, and access to the canal is most important. And so there's these narrow parcels to maximize them where people can access the canal. But the other reason that they're long and skinny is because if they carved it up smaller, they would have to cross all of these drainage canals to access their fields. So the longer the field was, the easier it was to have access to it from your farmstead, which was facing a main canal. And so there's lots of stuff in the Netherlands. This is outside Rotterdam, where you can see these long and narrow development patterns again, following these long and narrow agricultural lots. And I think I was familiar before with somewhere like Amsterdam with the very skinny houses. And I think part of that logic is here, where there's sort of precious access to the road or the canal. But there's also other things going on here where it's like you're taxed by the amount of frontage you have. So there's financial incentives to make it narrower. It was easier to build with shared party walls between the buildings. Like there's other explanations for what's going on in somewhere like Amsterdam in a scene like this necessarily than these big, long, block-long development patterns. Then there's places like this where it sort of goes from a drainage canal to a waterway. And I'll pause here. This one really puzzled me. Why is this the way that it is? And I'll see if you maybe have a quick thought.
Okay, so just to understand what we're seeing, the blue
Yeah.
is water.
Blue is water.
And is that like the ocean or a lake or?
I feel like a lake is
Is that a
generous.
secret?
It's surrounded by land. It's surrounded by stuff that is drier than it is.
So it's like a flooded, an unnaturally marshy, like flooded land or something.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty marshy, yeah.
Is this still the Netherlands?
This is the Netherlands, yeah.
Okay. That explains some things. Oh yeah, that's definitely Dutch up there. Because I mean, they're like below sea level, right? So I feel
Yeah.
like they're always messing with the water.
Right.
That like you create intentional places, like almost sacrificial floodplains when you've got water management issues, that this is an area where they've intended to kind of inundate, or something went wrong in an attempt to create canals or something, that this is kind of a sacrificial area, but they've maintained like some central corridors in it of value. But I have no idea. Don't feel strongly about that theory.
I mean, I'm wondering if it's like an agricultural thing too. Like there are certain crops that are grown and more.
Oh, it could be rice. Yeah, something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Coletta, I think you're a little closer. It's not agriculture, but it is extraction. So I couldn't figure out, why are these little
Oil?
islands, right? Like what do those do? How could that possibly make sense for anyone who was settling here, working the land here? And it turns out it is from peat extraction. So they would literally harvest the mud and they would drag it up onto these islands to dry it out and then use it as fuel.
Crazy.
For the industrial fuel. So there, I found this fun map of the town. You can see these long, skinny lots and these sort of peat islands, right?
What is this town?
Oh, I don't want to even try my Dutch.
Okay.
It's outside Amsterdam. You can see it here.
It's got like some J's in it, probably.
Yeah. There's a lot of consonants.
It's a little place. I've never heard of it. So
Yeah. Okay. So another category or type of this sort of linear development pattern at Ankerdorf is in particular a village. It's a linear village, but it's one that has sort of a central green, right? So something that looks like this. And so when I was looking at this type of this classic German settlement pattern, one, you can see the village with the central green, but you can also see these very long and narrow agricultural lots on either side. And this one is from Leopoldau, which is, at the time, was on the outskirts of Vienna. So I've made it from the Rio Grande back to Vienna here. And today, you can see that the village is still there just like it was the buildings are still there for the most part like they were. And you can see the remnants of those agricultural lots some of the fields are still there. And in other places, you see the development patterns that are following these lots. It's like, okay, I feel like this
Getting
is
somewhere here.
approaching definitive, right?
And I assume those were livestock farms because they were out sharing a common grazing land. Is that the theory?
I don't know.
My guess is back then they didn't have just like, it's not like today where you were only farming cows.
That's fair too.
Right? Like you had a variety of things going on.
This feels like an intensive application of the tragedy of the commons, though. Like that's going to be a very heavily grazed commons. Like if you're putting everyone's farms up to it. But anyway.
So I thought, okay, here's this example in Vienna, but does this explain the rest of Vienna? And I had a thought. When we were in Vienna, we went to the Vienna Museum, which just reopened a few months ago, and it's absolutely amazing. It's one of the best museums I've ever been to. So if you go back, I highly recommend it. For your friends who are there, I recommend it to them if they haven't been. But it was full of the sort of classic historical scenes of Vienna, multiple sieges of Vienna, other moments in Viennese history. And I thought maybe I can see some agricultural patterns in these battle depictions. But believe it or not, there wasn't a lot of focus on like land
where the property lines were.
These depictions.
Isn't that what the artist was going for?
Yeah. So I didn't have much luck. But I went through my photos and I took a picture of this map, which is a 1769 plan from Joseph David von Huger of Vienna. And in this one, to orient you, north is sort of in the bottom right of this picture, the way it's oriented. But if you zoom in a little bit, you can see these village patterns outside of central Vienna, where it's an important road into the city. There's a village that develops along it, and you can see these long, narrow lots going off to the side. If you look at another part of the map, you see this linear village, and you see these long lots going off to the side. So I'm like, okay, this is good. Like I've basically figured out why and how the lots here have gotten this way. But what I couldn't figure out is why they were like this here and not in the immediate surroundings. So I found a paper called Land Tenure and Land Relations in Austria, where they talked about when different parts of Austria were settled by different types of groups. And here we see that no further than the city of Melk, which is about 50 miles west of Austria, there was this initial wave of Germanic settlement that was mostly isolated farmsteads and didn't really have concentrated village centers. But east of there was another wave of Germanic settling between 1000 and 1150. And this was happening after like roaming hordes of steppe tribes as described here. Like there was a risk to safety, right? It was recently safe and settleable in this way. And so the villages were very compact in part for defense. So these street villages developed in a different way than these earlier Germanic ways of immigration. And then additionally, this bit at the bottom here, there was a different type of inheritance tradition that caused the land to subdivide. There were some other things going on. So I learned that the breakdown of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918 caused a famine, and there was an initiative to create lots of new farmsteads, including small farmsteads in the outskirts of big cities. So new agricultural lots being created and divided around Vienna. And then the other bit in this paper here about this practice of inheritance. And having this part of Austria have a tradition where when the owner died, the land was split between the heirs. That led me to the legacy of partible inheritance on farmland fragmentation, evidence from Austria.
Another banger.
Yeah, a classic. And in this map here, this white area is Vienna, and this area around it are sort of the outskirts of Vienna. And in here, this paper, they looked, first of all, they said that impartible inheritance where the land is not divided was traditionally the norm, which is why I saw what I did in other parts of Austria. But partible inheritance was common in specific areas, including around Vienna. And they looked at like the laws and traditions of individual villages throughout this part of Austria and whether they were impartible or partible inheritance. And then they did an analysis of whether the farms there were more or less divided. And there is like a statistical correlation between this inheritance pattern and how fragmented the land is.
So partible meaning like I give this half to Tess and this half to Coletta because I own this whole lot and
Or
I'm going to break it up.
if you die and have 4 sons, the farm gets divided into 4 parts, right?
Okay, got it.
Yeah. But they also had this helpful sort of model for what's happening. And so part of it was inheritance traditions, but there's other things like what are the people farming there, the soil that we had looked at before, how is land sales and the land market regulated, there's political issues. All of these are feeding into how the land gets fragmented. And with this idea of this inheritance pattern being the driver of this, I went back to France and said, okay, here's a map of the inheritance customs in old France. And you see in the blue are places with partible inheritance where the land is divided when the owner dies into smaller pieces. And in the red is impartible inheritance where largely the land stays intact. And you see that this northeast area of France, where I found these skinny lots that, eventually made it to North America, is one of these areas of partible inheritance.
Is whether or not it's partible something like a subject of local laws and regulations, I would guess, or?
I think ultimately it went back to just legal traditions and cultural traditions, right? These are customs that find their roots in the Middle Ages or before, maybe. So it's all pretty messy. And this is what that area looks like. Long, skinny lots that are developed along these linear villages. Villages which are influenced by Germanic culture nearby and sort of follow the same pattern of this linear village Germanic development pattern that we looked at all those examples of.
I wonder, and you might have an answer for this, but how has this pattern resisted like the modern incentives of the efficiency of consolidation? Like, how has it become? And I guess this is a question, right, for Europe generally.
Europe.
I know, like how has it like not allowed capitalism to break this tradition? And because some farmer just buys the whole block, farms it all with an industrial farming, like that would be far more efficient and profitable. But yet this pattern remains. Like, how does
Sometimes Europe
do
does things that are not far more efficient and profitable, Matt.
I know. That's why it's charming.
Well, and there's also a very strong tradition of property rights and ownership, right? And so it's not so easy to move property boundaries, right? In a Western system. But there are lots of like EU and like World Bank programs that try to tackle the problem of fragmentation because of the problems it causes for the productivity and efficiency of agricultural production, right? So that's definitely a field.
No pun intended.
Yeah. Okay. So here's a part of France where they also have partible inheritance, but it is not part of that central Germanic village development pattern. And that looks like this. It is still highly fragmented, but it doesn't have the long, narrow lots that are based off of those linear rivers, streams, roads, etc. So that was interesting to me. So on our visit to Vienna, we also visited some friends in Czechia who live in Pilsen. And I asked them about the long, narrow lots. And like normal people, it's not something they had thought about and didn't know off the top of their head why it was different in Austria versus Czechia. But offhand, they said it's probably communism. And the more I dug into it, it's a remarkably flexible and adaptable response in Eastern Europe in general, I find. Why is this that way? It's probably communism. Here's a paper on land reform and land fragmentation in Central and Eastern Europe. They suggested that maybe the reason it was different in Austria than its neighbors is because its neighbors were under the control of communist governments when Austria was not. And so I explored this idea a little bit more. And this is a little blurb about Czechoslovakia. Land was expropriated from large estates. State farms and agricultural production cooperatives were created. Big portion of the land was incorporated into these programs. And these cooperative and state farms continued to be merged through the 1970s into farms that were larger and larger and larger. And when you look at agriculture in Czechia or Slovakia, you can see the consequences of that. In Hungary, there were some land consolidation efforts, but also more permissions for local farmers and small farmers to maintain private ownership or more voluntary participation in these cooperatives. And here you see a village like this, where some of the big fields on the outskirts have been consolidated, but the small, like family plots close to the village still have this long and narrow development pattern. And then you have somewhere like Poland, where for the most part, the land was not expropriated or combined into these large farms. And a lot of Poland looks like this. It has this historical Germanic development patterns, village development patterns. It has this particle inheritance tradition, and it looks like this. And so here again, we see Austria on the left side of the yellow line and Slovakia on the east side of the yellow line. If this is what happened, if this is the reason why they are different, then presumably before the communist governments took over, both sides of this line would look the same. So I thought, okay, where can I go to see what Slovakia looked like before communism? And this is a suburb of Bratislava, very close to Vienna, where I began to look at these areas that were developed before communism. And so you can see these linear village patterns, and you see their long farm lots. There's like these little clues in there that, yes, this was the land of long and skinny lots before communism and looked much like Vienna did. If you zoom out, you can see that there's a big contrast between what is in town and the big agricultural fields that are outside of town. So this was highly suggestive, but not definitive yet. And I know you guys are fellow lovers of the Missouri Valley collection and the Kansas City Library and the 1940 tax assessor photos, which are basically diligent public servants took pictures of every single building in the city for tax purposes. And today we have this amazing historical record of the history of the city, right? So I was like, where can I find pictures of pre-communist Bratislava? And I found this resource, which I was not expecting, which is everything in green here is aerial photography that is available from World War II reconnaissance and bombing missions, basically made public. So there was a lot of bombing that happened in World War II, and everywhere that was
One of the,
bombed, that
one of the
there
few
are
benefits of the war.
yeah, like it's a weird data source, but I found it, and this is a picture of Bratislava,
Wow.
and in the center, I think you actually see the bombs falling, which is kind of disconcerting. But underneath the bombs, that is not yet blown up from the bombs, you see in this outskirts of Bratislava these long and skinny lots. So it's definitive. Both sides in Austria and Slovakia had the same pattern before the communists took over. So I think here we have an answer to that initial question: why are the blocks in Vienna so long and narrow? They were created incrementally as development occurred on these long lot agricultural parcels. It's a combination of historic Germanic village settlement patterns and also a culture of inheritance traditions that creates these divisions. This area is different from Western Austria because there were different settlement patterns there. It's different from its neighbors because the ownership in Austria wasn't disrupted by communist land seizures. And it's possible because to have these skinny lots because the soil here is uniquely fertile and suitable to smaller farm sizes. But finally, also learning that it's not unique to Austria, and you see this not just in Europe, but all over the world. This is China. This is Vietnam. Here's Egypt. These are probably the skinniest lots I found in this whole process. This is in the Nile Valley. These are development patterns as the rainforest is being cleared in Brazil. They're using this kind of development pattern. This is Chile. Although it's everywhere around the world, it's not in every place. So here's a very different development pattern for contrast. This is India, and this to me looks sort of like a fractal checkerboard. It reminds me like a camouflage pattern. Okay. Why have I taken you on this pointless journey? What does it all mean? This is a picture. This is a Viennese industrial park, by the way. So some of those are agricultural greenhouses and other sorts of things. But they're also developed.
Which I remember being very dramatic when flying into the airport. Like the warehouses were very long. So now this makes a lot more, that makes sense why. Like that it just was weird. I hadn't quite computed why.
Yeah.
But
It's blame roving steppe barbarians and middle age Germanic settlers, I suppose. This person in Wired thinks that medieval land parceling or ribbon farms are the future of urbanization in the United States. Basically, his thesis is that the United States developed in this scattered, non-concentrated way where the farmsteads existed before the transportation links and river connectors, et cetera. And that this creates a culture and ethos of sprawling development where transportation is built to connect far-flung places. And that's the source of our urban ills today in the United States, as opposed to places with these ribbon patterns where the efficient and logical corridor connection came first, and development was created densely around that to maximize access to this important resource.
but that also sort of flies in the face of like modern principles of urbanism, which are often just an accident of historical patterns that like these, right? But you would think that the x-axis, that makes sense. The density is there, but on the y-axis, it's not. Like you have these long parcels. And like I think of a city like Portland, which is sort of beloved because it has really short blocks, which creates lots of corners, lots of texture, lots of corner lots, and it's a pleasant walking experience. Short walking block lengths creates a lot of variety for the pedestrian. This is sort of flies in the face of that, where you have these ultra long uninterrupted blocks. Connectivity becomes difficult. So like I feel like it's only looking at it in one direction, right?
Yeah, there is a logic to it, but I don't know that it's the only logic that exists for how to live, right? Um, yeah, I don't know. This to me has the same sort of hubris as like a linear desert city in the middle of Saudi Arabia, right? Like it's um, not the narrow lot patterns, but this idea of of this pattern as a guide or savior for urban development seems a little thin to me. But before we get too far into that, I also want to propose to you that this long lot system reveals physical mysteries of the universe and is fundamental to the way reality is shaped. This is the constructal view of the long lot system, where basically they're saying that these long lot development patterns are reflecting imperatives of physical laws which must be emergent in the world in order to maximize flow put through these systems. And therefore, we should look at them as these manifestations of an underlying truth of reality that can shape our very existence. And I was like, well,
That's a lot.
yeah. And not just our cities, but, just the evolution of nature and the cosmos in general. So I think that's where I leave you. I started with why are these walks in Vienna long and skinny? But now I think, we should ask ourselves, what is our place in the universe? And I know you have friends in Vienna. So next time you talk to them, if you could maybe just say, hey, is this the reason your blocks are this way? That it would be good to confirm one way or the other.
I'm
We
sure
will
they'll
definitely ask him. He's actually from Kansas City too. He's both Austrian and American, but he grew up in Kansas City. So it will be, I think it's, if he doesn't know the answer to that, it's a good thing for him to talk to people about for the next several years. Try to figure it out. He's fluent in German, so he might get a totally different, sort of perspective.
Yeah, there were moments where I was copy pasting paragraphs from German research papers into Google Translate. I will admit.
Yeah, I'm very curious, like how conscious, if they're even conscious of the fact that the blocks are abnormally long or like atypically long and skinny, if they have any connection. Like it's the kind of stuff that this kind of stories that we want to talk about, right? Like in our own cities, like if you look into something, there's like way more to it than just happenstance stuff that just is easily in the background. But I bet most folks don't even notice, which is fine. Like you don't have to be a nerd and a weirdo.
Yeah,
I don't know. I think everyone should be.
Yeah.
I guess those fields and narrow agricultural lots are there, right? And because they're there, as Vienna grows, it will have to engage with them in some way, right? Like that's not a question of do we do it that way or not. But I do think it's interesting to think about the consequences of that environment on what the city becomes, right? Like, is a medieval inheritance custom the reason that I have to walk 3,000 feet before I can cut over to my neighbor's house, right? That's the part that interests me, I think, is how much of what we do is because of this combination of circumstance. And if we can recognize why that's happening, does that give us some ability to like push or pull some different levers and have some different things happen if we want, right? Because, I think before looking at this, I had seen European farms with little quilt blankets over the hillside, and I was familiar with Kansas squares and big circles you see from the plane with the irrigation, devices and that sort of thing. And there's almost a subconscious, this is the way things work and must work in that, right? And so,
Yeah.
but it's not true. There are totally different paradigms for how these things can happen. And those different paradigms create different outcomes and also give you different opportunities.
I wonder if there's either officially sanctioned or unofficial or subversive hacks to some of these patterns. So like if you have a 3,000-foot long block, if people are just cutting through each other's lots to get to the high street, that's the next one over instead of going all the way down and around. I assume that kind of stuff happens. Or
I mean,
Probably.
that is one of the remaining questions is like, why didn't you just break it up, right? If you're going to develop this long lot, why not just make 4 normal blocks? Why does it have to be one long block? And maybe I go back to my suburban municipal planning days to answer that, where, how many times are we in a meeting where a new subdivision is getting platted and the staff planner recommends that this street should connect to this street for the general connectivity of the neighborhood. And the people who are on that street right now just have a dead end that faces a farm field, and that new connection is going to ruin their life and traffic's going to run over their kids, right? There are all of these incremental development decisions. And I wonder if when you develop according to this unit of development in these narrow blocks, it's just easier to have it be self-contained, right? It's always easier to just focus on the land you control and create what you want to create. And it's not always the case, but it's the case often enough that you begin to get these like mile-long apartment complexes next to a mile-long single-family street, right?
yeah. And now thinking back to being in Vienna, it does definitely create like really dramatically immersive experiences on like the pedestrianized commercial streets because it does feel like they just kind of go on forever without interruption, which is now thinking back on it, it's sort of it messes with your mind a little bit because I'm like, I don't remember crossing cross streets very often. Like some of the areas that have some of the newer retail, like that's probably why. But I bet living there is probably less. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's a very Main Street oriented pattern, isn't it? Right? There's this in the village or on the shopping street in town. There's sort of the main street, which just continues as long as people are interested in being around other things, and
Yeah.
like that is the concentrating force of development there. Yeah, as opposed to somewhere like Kansas City, where we have like nodes and districts, right?
Yeah. And a very clear grid pattern where east-west blocks are this long and north-south blocks are this long, and it's always that way.
So, what do you think about this idea that our cities would be better if we developed with linear lots rather than a Jeffersonian grid?
I feel like it's too late for that, right? Like I don't know. I guess like we've already started this way and like we're not developing in a European pattern. So how do we like suddenly flip that switch?
Well, Coletta, I'm curious if you think like, is Vienna better or worse for these long, uninterrupted blocks in your experience of it, now that you kind of have been down the rabbit hole and back?
I don't know. I feel like it wasn't something that I was conscious of when I was there. So it's hard to kind of like answer that question. You know what I mean? Like I think if I went back next weekend, I would be very attentive to paying attention to that. But I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah,
Vienna is
and it's
ruined.
maybe less so within like the historical city walls, right? Like in there,
Yeah.
everything is just hyper dense.
Yeah.
I mean, my impression is like, and maybe I'm just like in the orthodoxy with this in terms of like good urban environments, but if we talk about human scale, then really long uninterrupted blocks kind of is the antithesis of human scale. And I think about like what I said earlier about Portland and why a lot of people use Portland as an example because it has short blocks, which creates a more human scale kind of experience. So I feel like maybe it would drive like macro development patterns, but I feel like the experience on the street is worse for it. And like, in American development now, like everything's a super block. Like if you've got a half-mile long block or parcel, you're going to build a half-mile long apartment building without any interruption because that's more economically feasible. Whereas having blocks and alleys and sublots like forces breakups of development and frontage and all of that. So it seems to me like that they would come with some pretty harsh consequences if you did that.
Yeah, as you say that, another thing I think of is a lot of these long lots were initially developed when there was a single point of access, a single river or road or canal, right? So of necessity, they were linear. But if you think of someone like a pedestrian, right? Like 2 miles of street in a single line is going to be more difficult for you to walk to the store and back versus 2 miles of a dense grid where the same amount of stuff will only be a few hundred feet away from you, right? Despite what those papers say, I don't know that it's an inevitable cosmic necessity that we must develop in these linear patterns, right? There are other logics with other advantages, and the grid does a lot of things that a pattern like this can't do.
Yeah, I mean, I've been overly indoctrinated in the church of the grid, so it's going to be hard for me to lose my faith.
You do that, Matt, because my current town of Annecy is in the process of degridifying its street network. In the next
for cars or for everybody?
Yeah. So in the next couple weeks, a process of blocking arterial connections between specific neighborhoods and pedestrianizing a variety of streets with a specific goal of reducing the number of ways that cars can pass through a neighborhood. So it's sort of the anti-American urbanism approach. It'll be interesting to see how it goes.
Well, it's just disrupting the grid for the automobiles, right? Not everyone else. This still enforces the development pattern. And I mean, I guess we're going to have to keep an eye on that. Sounds like a multi-story to me.
I'll keep you
All right.
posted.
Well, this has been the story of, the brief history of skinny lots in Vienna and sort of other parts of Austria, but not everywhere for various reasons that were discussed. Coletta, do you have any parting reactions, questions, observations?
No, I'm not ready to give a speech. No.
It was kind of like one of those, like, all right, sit back, pour yourself a cup of coffee. Like this is there's a lot going on here.
Yeah, it's very like detailed and in-depth sort of, you have to do a lot of digging. How long did that take you to get there?
It was about a week.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, is this the kind of thing you would have just done for fun to appease your own curiosity, and then you would have done nothing with the material, so now you have an outlet? Or maybe not to such an insane extent?
No, 100%. This is how I spend my free time.
All right.
Love it. Love
Well,
it.
now the world will benefit. The millions of new fans will benefit from your expertise.
Or be forced to suffer, I suppose.
I love it.